Hello and welcome to a new edition of SNJ in Conversation, where we're focusing on a decade following the Children and Families Act that came in 2014. I'm Sharon Smith, co-director of Special Needs Jungle, and my co-presenter today is Tanya Tiraoro.
Hello. Yeah, as Sharon mentioned, this is another look at 10 years of the CFA. And today we are joined by a lady whose name is synonymous with the development of SEND. Philippa Stobbs, OBE, is the recently retired Assistant Director of the Council for Disabled Children. She began her long career as a teacher and then spent over 30 years at the CDC as a dedicated advocate advising government ministers on SEN, developing policy and legislation, and starting the Special Education Consortium. She is, I have to say, the woman I have always admired the most for her knowledge, her determination, and her grace. Philippa Stobbs, welcome. We are delighted to have you speak with us today.
Thank you, Tanya and Sharon. I feel you're setting me up to be a massive disappointment, I think, with that billing.
Nonsense.
Could we start today by thinking about, or you telling us about the landscape for disabled children when you first started your career?
Oh my goodness. Yes, I mean, one of the most amazing, I taught before the introduction of the national curriculum. So my very first teaching job, I think I was charged with teaching the Romans for the third time to 7-year-olds. I mean, it was ridiculous. So of course, I'm a great enthusiast for a national curriculum that sets out children's entitlement. But I very quickly became interested in not how most kids learn, but really, what do we need to do to enable all children to learn? And I think, if you like, that is the biggest challenge we face today as well. So I became interested in how we could organise learning better for children who didn't learn so readily. And I mean, bear in mind, I just need to say this, that my first day of teaching was quite interesting how much teachers held to themselves. A great piece of advice from a senior colleague as I moved down towards my first classroom of 30 kids from the staff room was the only thing you need to remember is don't let the children take the books home with them. For sure, the parents will try and teach them to read, and for sure they'll get it wrong.
Oh, no.
Because it took Sheila Wolfendale's research around making sure books did go home with children to prove that actually involvement of parents in reading was absolutely vital. And you know, everyone, no one would question that today. But it is a very long time ago. That's my point. But there are some things that I think are really interesting in terms of sort of cycles of understanding and thinking about, as it were, where we are today has made me reflect back to earlier times, to the Warnock report. And interestingly, for some of the funding issues to the 90s, when nationally we first started delegating funding to schools. So there were some real echoes today of things that were happening when I first started teaching.
So Baroness Warnock, you mentioned there, said at the 2019 SEND inquiry, and I'm quoting here, in the 1970s, local authorities were regarded as benign and parents thought of them as allies on behalf of their children, and they were trusted to take an interest. The 1981 Education Act was the very worst year for finances, and it was from that moment on, LAs gradually became opponents as they were always trying to save money. So the 70s was a long time ago, but was it simply down to money?
No, I don't believe it was. I mean, jumping forward a little bit from Baroness Warnock, but I'd like to come back to her report in a minute. Interestingly, in the 1990s, the Education Reform Act of 1988 brought in both the national curriculum, and it eventually didn't happen straight away, and national school inspection rather than the local system that had existed before, and the delegation of funding to schools for the first time. And it was really, really interesting. With the introduction of the 93 Act, which obviously became part of the, Consolidated Act, the 1996 Act, which stood for a long time. What was interesting is that in doing some local work with local authorities and schools, I was working in Stockport, and Stockport brought together some data about the increase in the number of statements that had happened. I mean, not causally linked to, but as it were, following the introduction of local management of schools. And what happened was that the number of statements in special schools in Stockport remained roughly the same. And there was a massive increase in the number of statements in mainstream schools. And it was so from that point, there became, if you like, an incentive for schools to secure additional funding by securing a statement. And obviously, at times of austerity, that pressure becomes greater. And I would argue that that's what's happened since the 2014 Act, introduced in a period of austerity. Though I want to look at some other things that happened around the same time as well. But it strikes me that funding, yes, generates a pressure. And you can see that with the increase in plans since 2014 and the increase that I saw in the 90s. But actually, there are many other things that are relevant. Interestingly, local management of schools came in at the same time as the national curriculum. And initially, that did not allow for children with learning difficulties to progress up towards the national curriculum. And I think, we've got some echoes of that happening today. But I think when we introduced the 1993 Code, 1994 it was, but the Code of Practice arising from the 94 Act, a lot of people said, actually, this steer is more important than the money. It gave a framework for schools to think about how to address children's learning needs. And I look back on it now with horror because it was very procedural and not sufficiently educational. And I would say that's probably still a challenge for us today. But I think all those other things, such as curriculum, school inspection work, coming in at the same time as a period of financial austerity, did obviously contribute to that increased pressure, but I wouldn't attribute it solely to funding.
And in fact, in 2010, we did see a big drop in the number of statements as well, didn't they? After they were accused, as you said, of applying for too many just for, children whose difficulties maybe they did not think warranted them, and for children who had English as a second language as well.
I think the decrease in the number of statements came on the back of some work by Ofsted, and I would also say the Lamb Inquiry. And when Brian was leading the Lamb Inquiry, I was in the DfE as SEN and disability professional advisor, so I did all the sort of the legwork for the Lamb Inquiry, and that highlighted the fact that there wasn't really any discussion about outcomes for children at that point. No one was thinking, this is what we need to do so that this child can. And I had some really interesting conversations with groups of parents across the country who were all locked in battle with their local authority largely about the number of support assistant hours their child was going to get through a statement. And what was really interesting was that everyone was locked in a fight about the number of hours support assistant time. And one parent said to me, I'm going for 25 hours. I'm not, the local authority is saying 20 and I'm saying 25. So I just asked her, what is it she wanted to happen in that 5 hours that was contested, that was going to make a difference for her child? And she hadn't thought, that was quite apparent. But when I sort of said, well, what's going to happen in the 20 hours that you have been given that's going to really help your child? And again, she hadn't really thought. And around the group, it emerged that no one had actually discussed outcomes. What do we want to achieve for child? Therefore, what do we need to do? And there was a kind of sense of support assistant time being the currency, and therefore you wanted as much of this for your child as you could get. And also schools would want that as well. But when we started talking about outcomes, it seemed to me that most of what was being done for children was not actually going to help them to achieve what their parents did want them to achieve when we stopped and talked about it. So, for example, one parent said, "Oh, my son's about to leave school, but unless he learns how to travel independently, he's not going to be able to get to a college, training, a job." Another parent said, "Look, my child has got support assistant time in the classroom, but actually it would be really helpful if the classroom isn't too bad, but she's got real problems at break times and those sort of recreational times, and she's not making friends. And actually, it would be really good if she had the support assistant time at those times, just to help her to make relationships with her friends." And we all know that translates into the classroom, doesn't it? We learn in a collaborative way. We don't learn on our own. By and large, we learn collaboratively by testing out ideas with each other and honing our own thinking in the light of what other people have said. So you kind of start to understand what it is you think through that process. And I see that as being integral to the process of learning. And that's part of the changes, I guess, particularly since the 60s, thinking about education, but breaking away from that Victorian model. It's a wonderful description in I think it's in it might be in Bleak House, one of the Dickens stories, where the teacher, who's Mr. Gradgrind, you have this vision of his classroom where there are rows of empty jars waiting to receive gallons of imperial facts. And there's that there is no sense of that interactive need as a good fertile ground for learning. And I think the 60s did start to see that change. And with David Hargreaves' work in particular, that notion of that social context for learning. And a lot of his school improvement work was very much focused on that, how to enable that to happen. But I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit away from the track. But this is a really, really important context.
Yes.
Because what is happening to children with special educational needs at the moment is that, by and large, they are removed from their classrooms. They are removed from their classrooms and from their peers much more than other children. And it means, in consequence, they spend more time with adults and less time with their peers. And that removes that social learning context. And the work of Rob Webster and the inclusion illusion is really important in highlighting that. So I'm very keen, and also that started with the Blatchford work that showed that the detailed work in classrooms that was going on was separating children with learning difficulties from their curriculum, their teacher, and from their peers. And I think we've got still way too much of that happening. But we can't expect schools to suddenly turn around without being skilled and without being supported. And I mean, I'm talking about both specialist educational services and health and social care.
So you've just been talking about the importance of the context and the context of reforms being brought in. And we believe we've been doing our research and looking at things that maybe you've talked about in the past. And in 2011, you raised concerns about the SEN reforms being introduced at a time where maybe it was a problematic context and local authority budgets had been cut significantly, early intervention support services, which I believe you're saying, are really important, were also being diminished. So do you feel that some of the concerns you raised at the time were listened to? And do you think, in retrospect, it was right for the reforms to be pushed through and implemented at the time they were?
Well, one of the things I would point to is that the intention of the Children and Families Act was very firmly to improve the focus on outcomes, and those principles in Section 19, which the first time we've had actually a set of principles to frame what we want to try and do for children with special educational needs. That framing, I think, was really, really important. And that was informed by not just the Lamb Inquiry, but the Ofsted inspection as well, that said, actually, we are unnecessarily pushing children up the sort of procedural path without actually addressing their learning needs and improving outcomes for them. And you're quite right, at that point, there was a significant reduction in the number of children on the SEN register, if you like. So I suppose one of the other things I would point to is not just those principles and what the Children and Families Act, that section of the Children and Families Act was designed to achieve. I would say that was both well-intentioned, appropriate, and the right thing to do. And I would point to some really, really important other things that the Children and Families Act brought in. I mean, for a start, extending children's education up to their 25th birthday for children who needed to continue to have support to learn. And there was an absolutely groundbreaking case of a young man who was heading towards the Social Services Day Centre. He was, I think, 19 at the time, and a really inspired educational psychologist realised that he'd started using an iPad to support it. It hasn't been must have been given him by someone, I have no idea who, but she realised that actually he had significantly more potential to go on learning. And so, of course, the cessation of his statement, which was what was planned at the time, was then halted, and there was continuing support to his education. So up to 25, goodness, what a good thing to have brought in. I would also say that improved tie-in to health and social care was important. I know it's not perfect, but we're still trying to work on that. I would also say that I remember when the bill was first published, and obviously the Special Educational Consortium who I was working with then as the policy lead, we read through it. I took it home, read it through so many times. And there's this clause in the bill that said, none of this applies to young people in the youth offending, in the secure youth estate. And I mean, we were absolutely horrified. So first it was, why not? Surely look at the nature of our prison population and of the young people in our young offender institutes and in secure children's homes. Look at that, and look at the level of special educational needs there. Why?
So that they need it more than anybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And indeed, if their needs have been identified and met at an earlier point, they might well not be where they were, because with learning difficulties of any sort, they are more open to exploitation. They're more likely to get into difficulties in encounters with the police, for example, children with communication difficulties, for example. So it's actually that was quite shocking. So all of those things I would say were really, really important to bring in. Now, it did really sustain the pre-existing framework. If you like, it's the same framework that was brought in the 1981 Act as to how we were going to go about identifying, assessing, and meeting the needs of children with special educational needs. That system has been refined and refined and refined as initially there were no time limits on how long it might take you to draw up a statement. And there was a young boy in Birmingham, I remember, who his parents reporting to the Education Select Committee identified their child as having been the assessment being started 4 years earlier, and he still hadn't got his statement. So it's been refined. The right of appeal brought in 1993. That has been refined and refined. The decisions against which you could appeal and the decisions which weren't up for appeal, for example, on annual reviews, those have been introduced. So the process has been refined and refined and refined over years, but it hasn't been fundamentally redesigned. And it does mean, back to the point about local authorities, it does mean that there really has to be that collaborative local approach to make sure that we are seeking appropriate solutions to children's learning challenges through what we do, and to ensuring they're supported through health and social care agencies as well. I want to just keep reminding myself that, I speak primarily from an educational perspective, but these other things are so important to keeping children in their own home, in their own locality, and properly supported. So those things do make a huge difference as well. But the erosion of that local collaborative approach, I think, was exacerbated by, I was going to say the Academies Act in 2010, but actually there was a feeling around that time that, and this didn't just apply to academies, that we needed to see schools as independent professional decision-making bodies, and we gave more responsibility to schools. Now, sorry, this is back to the 93 Act and an anecdote when we were trying to make sure that alongside all those big major national developments, the local management of schools, the curriculum, inspection framework, etc., that we were actually protecting children with special educational needs. And I remember a meeting with Eric Forth, who was the schools minister at the time, and SEC went to see him and said, look, in effect, you have given schools all the money, but you haven't explained that with that funding came additional responsibilities.
Yeah.
And he said, no, you're absolutely right. We've done that, and we haven't explained that to him. And that was when he turned around and he said, look, it was kind of the solution at the time. Well, schools need to have special educational needs policies, and they've got to set out all this stuff in what they were going to do about children's learning needs. And that was really quite important recognition of the fact that schools had those responsibilities, and that these other pressures, these big new things that were being introduced, didn't change that, and we acted as a really strong reminder. And I think that the message in 2010 obviously precedes the Children and Families Act.
Yeah.
Very strongly, schools, you are independent professional decision-making bodies in your own right. And in a sense, not necessarily spoken alongside that, but you don't need local authorities. And there was an erosion of that sense that this needed to be collaborative, and that this is not something schools can do on their own. And I think that was lost. In a sense, that message was lost before the introduction of the Children and Families Act. But I mean, I would say that the impact of austerity clearly, and yes, it was austerity for schools, which created pressures on them, but the cuts in local authority funding were much more swingeing. And there was a general sense that, if you like, we didn't really need local authorities. And yet there was this inconvenient fact that they held this responsibility for children whose needs could not reasonably be met in schools on their own. So I think that, that is a very significant consideration, both the funding pressures and that message that schools, if you like, can do it on their own, and the role of the local authority was being downplayed. But I would say there was something much more significant that happened in 2014 that had the impact in terms of increasing that pressure for an EHC plan. And that was the introduction of the national curriculum, the revised national curriculum in 2014. And that was designed to ensure that all children had entitlement to a certain body of knowledge. So through that focus, the role of other key features of our biggest national learning framework, I think, were downplayed. So the importance of skills, and I think we see that now. And I remember when the IBAC the EBAC was brought in, the design and technology was removed from that top scoring. GCSEs were in that important basket for the measurement of outcomes at GCSE and for progression at GCSE. And in that year, the professional body for design technology teachers noticed that a number of design technology teachers were either having their time cut or were losing their job. And again, in the context of austerity, where school budgets are being shrunk, you focus on the things you know you've got to do. Yeah. And so that erosion of the importance of skills alongside academic learning, I think, was an important factor in the new curriculum. And the other thing that was, if you like, sacrificed in the name of all children being able to access this content was that notion of sequencing learning, building on what children could already do. Now, this for me is the big impact of the introduction of the 2014 curriculum. I was working with primary schools at the time, and they almost immediately said, look, this is making it much, much more difficult for us to teach inclusively. Not impossible, and they were pulling out all the stops to try and make it work. But where you are on a tight budget, where you are under pressure as a teacher, to find that additional capacity to redesign the curriculum you've been given is a big ask. And what's very noticeable to me is that the gap in children reaching the expected level at the end of Key Stage 2, so the age of 11, that gap it's actually figures just before the pandemic, and I want to pick it up as a point about the implementation of the 2014 curriculum rather than sort of where we are now. That gap was at 35%, so over a third of children who were not getting to the expected level. Now, you might say, well, look, expected level is an arbitrary point that we have determined is the point we want children to get to. Yes, but the problem is that the Key Stage 3 curriculum is based on an assumption that will have got to that expected level. And therefore, a third of children moving into Year 7 are not immediately able to access the Key Stage 3 curriculum. And that's the problem. And that, accounts for some of the huge number of children who've who were falling out of secondary schools without any particular, they were just disappearing from school roles. And you know, that awful tension for primary schools about this massive content, but you know, in the hands of creative teachers, of course, you can do that, and you can find that learning sequence and find it for individual children. But I do think that, you know, and I'm in touch with the schools today who's got some fabulous curricula they've adapted so that all children can access that curriculum. But that I think is probably one of the bigger pressures on schools, and the assessment regime that went alongside that, which resulted eventually in us not actually having criteria against which we assess the progress of our if you like, our slowest learners, our learners who are learning at the very earliest stages, the developmental stages. And I think that is a tragedy that we don't know nationally how those children are progressing. And I think I would argue it's one of the most uninclusive things. But I think all of these things have made it a matter of choice for schools, whether they choose to be inclusive or not. And I think that really, for me, undermines that notion of an education system that is for all children. And that, I think, is the biggest challenge we face today, that we don't have an education system that is for all children.
Yeah. And of course, it was supposed to be. That was the idea for the 2014 reforms. Yeah. And you were instrumental in the Green Paper for that, along with Brian Lamb. And I remember it was called like support and aspiration for every child to get the education that they need. But when the bill came out, it was quite watered down from the Green Paper. What aspect do you really regret not making it through from those the original ideas?
I would argue about that. I don't think. Yes, there are questions about how aspirations were incorporated, but I think that was about practice rather than about what was set out in the legislation. And I think the Green Paper, I mean, Tanya, that Green Paper had bits in it that said that quoted David Cameron to reverse the bias towards inclusion, and that was in the Green Paper. I've kept that quote from that Green Paper. You know, that intention included into the Green Paper, based on David Cameron's commitment, was to reverse the bias towards inclusion.
They're still kind of doing that now, in a way. If you look at them, they're talking on one hand about more children in mainstream, and yet they're building more special schools instead of using the money to make buildings more accessible for children.
And I would argue that it by and large, it isn't about the buildings. It is about the curriculum and the teacher training that we need to have in place. And I mean, to be honest, from where we are now, it isn't even just that. We need a massive workforce plan. And I think it's, you know, this needs to look at, yes, initial teacher training. It needs to look at post-experience training for teachers, but for all teachers, not just piling everything onto the SENCO. The SENCOs have become sort of bureaucratic managers rather than educational experts helping their colleague teachers to see how they might be able to enable this child to access this particular concept, this bit of learning. So
this is, I suppose, what the Universal Send Services program with Whole School Send is about, upskilling all teachers. The problem that, I mean, and Sharon and I are both involved in an advisory group for this, but what we're seeing, I think, is that although there is a lot of interest in it, that when I've been speaking to people in schools, they've never heard of it. So it's not being taken up.
It chimes with my point about inclusion having become a choice, and you need a head and senior leadership team and a governing body who are committed to that, to really see it through. And that choice, I mean, my view, it stinks. Our school system is funded publicly. It is a public service, and we should be making that available to all our children. And it really is. There should not be a choice about teaching inclusively. But I'm not even really, bizarrely, I'm not really arguing about inclusion. I'm really talking about improving outcomes for children, and how you do that. I recognise that some schools would really struggle to find a way of making sure they could include children, but because some schools do, all children with any type of need are included somewhere in our country. So it should not be a matter of choice. But I think that the trick may be not to focus on inclusion, i.e., how many numbers of children can we get back into mainstream schools or stop falling out of mainstream schools, but actually focus on how we can enable those children to learn and get good outcomes with them, as it were, if you like, wherever they are, because that will show us what we've got to do. And if we had better training and preparation for teachers, if we had that consistent commitment that our schools were for all of our children, if we had that specialist support available to schools to help them where we should not be expecting them to meet needs from their own resources, and I don't mean necessarily funding resources, I mean from their own, their training, their capacities, their expertise, their skills, where we know that that's going to need to be supported from beyond the school. We need to make sure that those services are there to support them. There's a tendency to blame schools for not being inclusive, and there's a tendency to blame local authorities for not meeting their duties. Actually, this is not something anyone can do on their own. And in my view, parents and children, young people themselves need to be at the heart of that. They need to be there, involved in that development of that ordinarily available provision. It is not something you can impose at the local authority level. It's something that you have to develop collaboratively, and you have to go on nurturing it, because you have staff turnover, you have different parents and different children coming into this. That needs to be reviewed and revised on a regular basis. I feel very, very committed to our schools becoming more inclusive, but I actually think by focusing on inclusion, we tend to generate a battlefield rather than generating a really collaborative approach to supporting children's learning. And as I say again, schools can't do this on their own. It needs a much wider approach. So I think, we really need to restore local services. We need to ensure that through the new integrated care boards, for example, that we are bringing in health and social care alongside education to ensure that children can stay in their local school with their peers, with their family. And at the moment, I mean, one of the problems, Tanya, you refer to the special school building program. I'm completely with you, and I'm appalled that but I don't see any solution other than building some more special schools at the minute, because at the moment a child who is coming out of a mainstream school and the local special schools are full are being catapulted into remote residential special schools, and that is so much more undesirable than having something that is still at least local. It's not the way we should be going. But one of the challenges of the system now is that all of the things that, in my view, we need to do are really long term. And that, so any incoming government, whenever the general election, any incoming government is not, we have to be really clear, is not going to reap the benefit. It's not just going to be one parliament, it's going to be two parliaments and potentially more before we really start to see a difference. But I in that context, I would say that absolutely the most urgent thing for any incoming government is going to be to address the state of our early years services.
Post-pandemic, because obviously we had the reforms come in, and then we've had the COVID pandemic, which we're still seeing the impact of now. We're seeing children with more complex needs arising, but also increasing exclusions, which you've just alluded to, in terms of children being unable to engage in mainstream education, or schools saying we can't meet needs. What do you think that mainstream schools right now could and should be doing to support those students, those pupils who are really struggling to stay in mainstream school for a whole variety of reasons?
Specifically post-pandemic, because we've got a cohort of children who were not in that early years group provision, and we know, this hit the national news at one point, that some of them have come in with speech, language and communication delay, and have then had to wait for speech and language therapy, and ultimately getting that help and support. Those children have been identified as having really significant speech and language impairments, which needed that professional support, would have needed it anyway. But because of that time lag for so many children, that cohort of children coming into schools, or, still in their in very young years during the pandemic, they have not had their needs identified and met in an appropriate way. And for an older cohort of children who were actually not having a good experience of school, and who found that actually learning at home was a lot more comfortable for them, the difficulty of getting those young people, but largely the slightly older cohort, getting them back into school, re-engage with their peers, becomes more difficult the longer they are out of school, because they're more likely they're going to go into school and actually find in the classroom that I don't know what any of this is about, because they've got gaps in their learning. And even well-intentioned schools who've really tried to smooth the path back in for those young people have found it difficult to maintain and adjust their approach to, because if something fails and a child finds it too overwhelming and doesn't come back in the next day, actually schools need to really persevere with that young person to make sure that they can read and keep under review the arrangement they're making to keep them in. And that's, it does set a new set of challenges for our school system. Yes, the unidentified or the left unaddressed needs of children, and that other cohort who've just found it that school is not really a very welcoming place. The children, if you like, who might have got excluded if they'd been in school, but they realise school doesn't suit them, or that school doesn't suit them, and they've chosen themselves to absent themselves. And I think we've got therefore a massive further erosion of entitlement, and it worries me that a lot of the work on absence is leading to further blame and pressure on parents instead of addressing the underlying educational need. And that's it's the same, if you like, for me, with the 2022 Green Paper and the 23 Improvement Plan. You know, we've got that very simple analysis of what's wrong with the system, and you know, I don't disagree with it. You know, we've got poor outcomes for children. I mean, in effect, we've got angry parents, and when we've got a funding crisis. The problem is we're only addressing, through what we're trying to do, we're only really addressing the funding crisis. So we're starting from the wrong point. We're not actually going to say, okay, let's start with children outcomes. Because if we start with that, if parents feel their children's needs are being identified and met, they're not going to be going to the local authority saying, "You need an EHC plan for my child." I'm a bit of an advocate for ordinarily available provision because I've seen it working so brilliantly. People come together, and you know, in one place, when you know a near final draft was circulated around. This was an early years version. Circulated around, and some of the early years SENCOs came back and said, you know, you're not expecting enough from us. We can do more than this. You know, but I think once you get that conversation going, I think it's really good. But ordinarily available provision, I mean, it's a weird term, and that's not the term in the current regulations. But it came, I think it was 1999 regulations that brought it in. This is not new stuff. What was new, and the benefit of the Children and Families Act, was that it brought it into the local offer regulations. Mm-hmm. And the benefit of that is, as I've said, you know, that because it sits there, it has to be done in this collaborative way. It has to be up there on the website. It has to be reviewed. It has to, you know, we have to get feedback. We have to take that into account. We have to respond. You know, all of those things. This thing that's been sitting there, weirdly called ordinarily available provision, because of how it was phrased in the original regulations. Now I think it's expected to be available, but it's interesting. I did a little survey of ordinarily available provision around the time that the Children and Families Act was introduced, as I thought, well, you know, there it is in the local offer regulations, as you know, it's a requirement. How are local authorities addressing this? And there were some really excellent documents on local authority websites. But my goodness, you had to look hard to find them. You had to really know, because of course it was might be called absolutely anything locally. You know, local provision, or some of it was called graduated response. Mm-hmm. You know, which often it did set out. But by and large, the simpler it is. In other words, more simply we articulate what schools are expected to do on their own. And you might want to add, you know, what they can do with additional support from outside. It cannot possibly ever address the provision you might need to make for any child who turns up on your doorstep. It can only ever act as a guide. But of course, you can come back and revise it. If people say, actually, look, we haven't got enough about this. What are the things that we might be doing in this area because we've got a problem with this? So very often the reasonable adjustments that we make might be something, it doesn't cost anyone anything. It might be where a child sits in the classroom. It might be allowing them to go from the classroom a bit early, so that they don't meet that busy time in the school corridors where they get very anxious. So it's all sorts of things that might or might not be written into the locally agreed ordinarily available provision. But if you are approaching the Equality Act directly for that child, you are going to start from what your observations say that child needs. You're probably not going to rush off to your compendium and say, well, should I be doing that under an ordinary available provision or should I not? No, you've got to do it.
And yet local authorities, it seems, when they're preparing these OAP docs, as I've seen on numerous websites, they are using it as another barrier to prevent parents applying for EHCPs. They're saying like, well, unless the school has tried all of these things, that I mean, obviously completely unlawful, but parents don't know the difference. So that really is a danger that it's going to create more barriers. Not that it's not a good thing, but it needs to be, open and transparent and not used as another stick.
Absolutely. And I go back to the point that I made. We need to focus on the learning and how we can enable that. And we need, as far as possible, to steer away from those adversarial moments, which are now turning into real crisis points. Parents, children, young people, desperate for the help they need, but actually the help is probably there, but just not being appropriately identified. And also the problem about the delay in identifying and meeting need, which means that the need has grown, the gap between that child and their peers has grown, and so the need becomes the greater. I mean, there's a risk that we don't actually we don't actually avoid the need for an EHC plan. We just delay the need for an EHC plan, and it becomes a more expensive process.
You've been talking already about how maybe some of the things that we need to improve outcomes for children might already actually be available with ordinarily available provision, if schools are being empowered to actually focus on individual children and supporting them in their education and their inclusion. We're now in a position where we've got the SEND and AP improvement plan, the SEND change programme testing out some of those proposals. Are they potentially adding new levels of bureaucracy, new layers? So we've got the local inclusion plan, we've got the tailored list of schools, which may be potentially limiting choice even further. We've got the national standards. Do you think that the reforms that are now being tested are the right reforms to be tested, or do you think that actually there are other things we should be focusing on at the moment to improve things for children?
I think if it's not going to change children's learning in classrooms and the support that schools get to support children's learning in classrooms, or ensuring that the other local services are there, the health and social care services, I don't think it's worth exploring. I think it's a wild goose chase. That is my test for any of the reforms. Now, I guess in amongst some of the things you mentioned, the local inclusion plan, if you like, has some potential. If, for example, it builds on the locally agreed, ordinarily available provision, if it builds on that and starts to support a more collaborative approach across the local area to children staying in their local school and in their local community and in their own home, if it really could improve that, then that would be a good thing. The tailored list of schools is not going to do anything to support children's learning. It's another defence line in a already very congested battleground, and I don't think it helps at all. My thoughts about the standards are that if you approach standards through the lens of ordinarily available provision, and if you adopted a research approach, if you looked at, okay, so nationally, it looks to us as if, well over 50% of local areas have agreed these sorts of approaches for children with language and communication difficulties. These, and actually, we know from research these rigorous, we can actually say nationally, this looks like it's a good thing to do. We have a rather wobbly research. It's not completely lacking, but we have a rather wobbly research base for the ways in which we do meet children's needs, and that, you know, the standard application of support assistance without a proper framework around that is one of those sort of, if you like, a sort of sticking plaster that is applied and can undermine, as we've said, what I've said, the potential for children to learn and learn well. If we can drive it through developing our research base, absolutely. But it could only ever be, in my view, could only ever be support to those locally agreed systems.
Yeah.
It could not be dictated from Whitehall. If it were, I think the DfE would find themselves in a very difficult position, because I think they would find that much of the battleground between schools, parents, local authorities would actually shift to Whitehall. I think the one thing that we haven't really picked up, hasn't really been picked up in the Green Paper and the Improvement Plan, is about the Equality Act, because I see this as such an important part of children's entitlement. I think the Equality Act has been downplayed. I mean, I would almost say, I think we've lost sight of it, really, in there. I mean, that may be partly because there have been other equalities issues that have really hit the headlines, and it's easy to forget that is really, really important for disabled children in our schools. And I think around about the time we told schools they were independent professional decision-making bodies, we also started down the path of a different regime in terms of behaviour policies. And we had the development of some zero tolerance policies that cut across the Equality Act duties. And, you know, that's a problem, because it tends to make schools think about, you know, is this child, you know, an angel or a sinner? We tend to sort of think you've either committed an offence or you're doing the right thing. And actually, without taking into account the fact that some children need help to follow the rules, some children need that support and those adjustments to follow the rules. And I think that may have contributed to the downplaying of the role and the importance of the Equality Act. The 2018 judgment from the upper tribunal, I don't know if you recall, but children who were deemed to have a tendency to physical violence were deemed not to be disabled and therefore not covered by the Equality Act duties. And that stems from the fact that, I mean, my reading of it stems from the fact that the Disability Discrimination Act, when it was first introduced, was primarily focused on disabled adults, albeit it applied to children's services, but it didn't apply to schools. And that was possibly because we just introduced that first code of practice in 1994. And maybe ministers thought, actually, it's fine, we've got this covered because we've got this new legislation and a new code of practice that's covered. So it wasn't extended to children in schools until 2001. And the definition wasn't really adjusted to think about the implications for children. And of course, there are areas of adult behaviour which are excluded, and it is tendency to physical abuse, tendency to sexual abuse, voyeurism. You know, there's a number of things that are excluded from the definition of disability. And importantly, and this coincides, the House of Lords was looking at this and considering whether this exclusion of children with a tendency to physical violence, was that actually meaning that reasonable adjustments weren't being made for them, and in some sense it was relieving schools of the duty to make reasonable adjustments for children, even where a reasonable adjustment had a reasonable adjustment been made, maybe they wouldn't have had that violent outburst. So I think that 2018 judgment said no, for the purposes of children in education, a tendency to physical abuse does not exclude them from the provisions of the Equality Act. That's really important. And in a sense, perhaps we haven't exploited that enough to say, look.
It was the National Autistic Society backed.
Yes.
Well, we did cover that, actually. Yeah, it was a landmark ruling.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, we haven't actually made sure that judgment has got embedded in schools practice. And I think one of the things we really need to do is to increase awareness of the duties, very clear duties, that fall on governors to make sure their school is complying with the Equality Act duties to disabled pupils, amongst all the other things they have to comply with. But that's really, really important that we try to get that better embedded, because it does genuinely, I think, hold enormous potential for improving, reducing some of the inequalities in the system. With the public sector equality duty there, and in all honesty, we don't really know how well schools are meeting those duties. I mean, because I like stumbling around school websites to see what they've said about this. A lot of school websites set out what the public sector equality duties are, but doesn't then go on to say, here is our information published for this academic year. And here are our objectives, our 4-year objectives for reducing some of these inequalities. And I think, maybe we need to try and do something about that and get a real understanding of what the Equality Act should mean, way it's implemented in.
But it's also, I mean, underpinned. Everything you've been talking about here is underpinned by culture and by the will to want to do these things. And culture change is something that we've talked about for a long time. And I believe it's one of the reasons, the lack of culture change has been one of the reasons that the 2014 Act was derailed in many, many senses. But I mean, how do you change those attitudes when the prevailing narrative within government itself is of a hostile environment and, as you said, zero tolerance behaviour policies?
Yeah, and I think you can only do it through agreed approaches, because so long as we, the zero tolerance approaches, which don't take account of the need for reasonable adjustments, they are likely to be driving children out of that school, because once children feel they are not wanted, not welcome in that school, they don't have any investment in that school any longer, and therefore are more likely to lash out, more likely to disregard rules, even if the very reason that they weren't regarding them in the first place was not really down to them, that the school should have adjusted the policies for them. But you can only do it by what our current systems value. We, at the moment, we value the outcomes. I mean, I do remember there's some very strong messages from one of our earlier secretaries of state that actually really the only valued outcome from education was to get into one of our top universities, which of course leaves the vast majority of school leavers being a massive disappointment to that minister. So I think we need to value a wider range of outcomes. That plays back into the point I made about curriculum and assessment, that wider understanding of a breadth of achievement which goes beyond mastering a body of knowledge. We need to recognize that and value it. We need, therefore, a wider range of certificates and qualifications that are recognised in any of our outcome measures and any of our progress measures in schools. At the moment, if you leave primary school below the expected, you're unlikely to be able to contribute to progress and achievement outcomes in that school. We measure what we value, should be the way around. If we value that wider range of achievement, which is for the benefit of all children, and who knows, might even help to address some of the mental health problems we seem to be generating because of the rigidness of that assessment regime, I think is a contribution to the lower mental health of young people in our schools at the moment. So if we also value that, then we should be, our inspection system should be much more focused. And the 2019, obviously revised in 2023, education inspection framework does seem, and Tanya, you were there in SEC when we were discussing the new framework. It has much more reference to inclusion. It has more reference to the progress of different groups of children. But I question whether that's translated into schools' experiences of inspection. And I think, we probably have some questions to ask about whether we are genuinely, through our inspection system, valuing the progress of all children. And that's important for the children themselves, of course, but for the teachers, that all that effort that goes in from the committed teachers who are supporting children's learning, if you like, to some extent against the odds of the way the system has been designed, then if we're not valuing that, then we're not giving those teachers that sense of achievement either. But I do also think that we should perhaps be thinking about looking at compliance with perhaps the public sector equality duty, because schools have got to publish that information and those objectives, information annually, and the objectives every 4 years. Perhaps if we were to undertake a research program, so what are schools saying here? To what extent are they actually meeting it? And can we actually give that some higher profile? And obviously seizing any opportunity that you guys seize, that that I seize, that we all seize to remind schools of these duties, which are good because they are direct duties on schools and they are all reasonable.
We've had a bit of a whistle-stop tour in our conversation today when we've gone back to the 1970s. So our question now is, if you look back at your long career, what would you say stands out as the biggest win for disabled children? And what would you have most liked to have been involved in fixing or putting right? So the biggest win and the one thing that you would have liked to have been able to help fix.
Well, some of the big wins, such as the extension of the SEN requirements to young people in our secure estate, don't necessarily have the impact that you hope they will. And it's a question that a number of people have been asking is, how well are those duties being implemented in our young offender institutions, in our secure children's home? So something like that might seem like a big win. I would probably, one of the big wins was making sure that Stephen Kingdom, when he was Deputy Divisional Director in the DfE, that he removed that reverse the bias towards inclusion phrase from the Green Paper. And I imagine he's quite proud of the fact that he did. But and some of the biggest wins don't really look like big wins at the minute. I mean, it was the Nursery Education and Grant Maintained Schools Act in 1996, just before the Labour administration came in, which extended the code of practice, the SEN code of practice, to early years. But when you look at how look at the state of our early years provision now, because we've promoted quantity over quality, and we know that it's that quality early years provision that means that children are less likely to develop a special educational need at a later stage. It's those important things that I think we've lost sight of. So there's, if you like, some of the wins that I would point to are at the moment in not a very good state and are going to need a lot of really focused attention to put them back onto a better path. And, you know, I would include working relationships with parents in that. Yeah. I mean, some of the Pathfinder work in the run-up to the Children and Families Act was wonderful in the way engaged with parents. And I think genuinely, you know, the research showed that actually there was better working relationships with parents. Parents felt more involved or whatever. But some of that work was actually not very well thought through, because it was, if you like, a moment of let 1,000 flowers bloom. And then in on top of that came what the requirements were going to be. So, I mean, I was shown some lovely, draft EHC plans. So this is the sort of plan we would really like to have for our child by parents. And I looked at it and realised that under the legislation, it wouldn't deliver anything for that child.
Right.
It might be a lovely plan with a nice picture of the child on it and a nice bit of something the child has written about themselves. But actually, there was nothing in that plan that would be delivered or that would have to be delivered for that child. So it was a moment of lovely engagement, a lovely experimentation. But actually, we should have had a bit more of a framework around that. It's got to be able to deliver what this child needs.
Yeah. Which comes back to that focusing on outcomes, which you were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And that for me is the hub level. Does this help a child in any classroom in the land to learn better?
Yeah.
If it does, it's a good thing. If it doesn't, it's not.
Philippa Stobbs, thank you very much for this incredibly informative and very passionate conversation that we've had today. As we've looked back at, I was going to say a decade on from the Children and Families Act, but I think we've gone back way further than that, which has been brilliant.
Let's try 5 decades, yes.
Absolutely. And I think both Tanya and I would say that we have learned over the years, have learned so much from you. So we are really grateful to you for everything that you have achieved and you have contributed to for disabled children.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to just talk about things. It's really lovely to talk about them in quite a sort of open way. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
It was our privilege. And please do subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. And if at all possible, a small donation to help keep the lights on would be always appreciated wherever you're listening.
Thank you again,
Sharon?
Philippa.
Thank you for me too.